Now let's look into a kube config. So welcome to the world of Kubernetes, and specifically the one which makes you to use a kubectl, that is a kube config. Welcome to the kube config. When I first executed my kubectl commands, in few minutes I started wondering how this kubectl is connecting to the Kubernetes cluster. How does it know where is my master node, and how does it get authenticated and get all that information from the cluster, or even create information in the cluster? How does it do? How is it doing? That is the answer is kube config file, through config file. So in this slide, what we are going to discuss is all about kube config file exercise. So let's what we are going to do here is we will look into the documentation of kube config. Then we will explore config file in kops kops instance, and third we will use the config file in our local machine to connect with our cluster from local machine. For that we have to install kubectl in our local machine, and we will try some commands from local machine. That's what our agenda for this exercise. Now let's get into the documentation of Kubernetes. Documentation of a config file. So let me type, here you can see the config file, but let me type kube config. Kube config files. Yes, this is our documentation for the kube config files. What is kube config file will do? Organizing cluster access. That's it. The one point. It organizes the cluster access using kube config files. Use kube config files to organize information about clusters, users, namespaces, and authentication mechanisms. This is very important. I will put it here. So that's what the kube config file will do. Okay, cluster, it will have information, it will organize information about clusters and users and namespaces and authentication mechanisms. Okay, so the kubectl command align tool uses this kube config files to find out the information it needs to choose a cluster and communicate with the API server of a cluster. This is what I'm going to show you again. API cluster, API server. That's what another thing you're going to find out here. That is API server in master node. And by default, kubectl looks for a file named config. That's very important. That will be located in home directory .kube. directory. So this is where you will find out. So you can specify other config files by setting up a kubeconfig environment variable to this kubeconfig flag. Okay, then you can read about context, but before that let's get into our instance, and we will open the kubeconfig file. So sudo I'm in root user home directory. Then here I am gonna give that kube config file directory. So I would say let me do cd and tilde, that's a present directory, and forward slash, it's in root virtual, it's in present directory, that's a root user home directory. Then we have a dot, and it's a cube because it's a Kubernetes. Inside that we'll find out. Let me do ls, and here you should see cache and config. We have two directories. We have two files in it. One is cache, other one is config, and cache is directory. Let me do ls l, and here you see that cache is directory, and this is a file, config file. So here we should clearly see our file. Okay, and this is where the file will be located, and that's what it's mentioned here, home and cube. Okay, now what all this consists of, it consists of a context. What is a context? It consists of a context element. A context element in a kube config file is used to group access parameters under a convenient name. So each context has three parameters: a cluster, a namespace, and user. Okay, by default the kubectl command line tool uses parameters from the current context to communicate with the cluster. So let me show you that. I will do cat and config, and let me scroll up to the context section. Yeah, here is the context section. You see that this context section will be till here, current context. So this consists of information about cluster, user, a name, and current context. So basically this context, what it will do, it marries the cluster and user. Basically it connects the cluster and user. Here both are same, kubewipro.mlag.com, kubewipro.mlag.com, but they are not same because one is the name of the cluster, other is the name of the user. So this context makes a provision that user can able to access the cluster, and the name of the context is kubewipro.mlag.com, and here the current context, you can see that this is what the current context. And if you see that what it's saying, uh, the current, the command line, the cubes by default, the kubectl command line tool uses parameters from the current context to communicate with the cluster. So whatever the current context you have mentioned, so kubectl by default it uses the current context to communicate with the cluster. So you can use this command basically to get the current context from our okay. So kubectl config, you see that the current context is kubewipro.mlag.com. Of course, you can read in directly look into that file. Then we have a kubeconfig environment variable. So you can directly use this. The kubeconfig environment variable holds a list of config files. For Linux and Mac, the list is colon delimited. You can put a lot of config files, but you have to separate or delimit using colon. Then merging kube config file, and I would urge you to go through this file documentation of kube config file, and here is an example. So proxy is just an example of how a config file looks like. You can configure kubectl to use a proxy per cluster using proxy URL in your kubeconfig file. So API version, you see that kind. A type of object is config object. We have seen a lot of objects, and out of them, one of them is config. And here you have a cluster information, user information, and context information. This is what a config file consists of. And then cluster information, you have to mention the cluster, and then server. Here is that. The server is API server, and then name, and here is the user. Then the context actually marries this, connects this user with the cluster. And here you can see the context. And you can create a lot of access multiple config files. Just go through this. And now let's go through the config file one more time. So we have seen a context. We have seen, yeah, this is a cluster information first, and then a cluster. And let's look into the cluster information. The certificate you have seen, and this is very important, a server. So what is this? This is API URL, a server URL. This is a server URL. Where, what is this server? It's a API server. I'll show you that. Let us get into this. Amazon EC2 instances, and Route 53. Hosted zone, kubevipromlike.com, and scroll down. Now you should find, you see that API kubevipromlike.com. This is a API server, and you just copy this and paste it in sticky note here close to the API server. Now let's get into the EC2 instances. You should see the master node public API, public IP same. So EC2 and it's Tokyo. Let me get into the Oregon, that's US West, and EC2 instances. Just 4 is up and running. Now let me click on master, and this is master node, and you see that. I'll copy this and let's compare both. Space it and paste it. You see that 54201, first 2 octets and second 2 octets exactly same. That's what I'm saying. Now I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Let's get back to the our here, not this one, other one. Yes, this is what I want to show. You see that a master node consists of a API server, because I have shown you all those things theoretically. Now I have to show you practically. So this is a master node. I'll show you the master node now. Let me get into the instances, and this is our master node. Clear? This is our master node. Now this is our master node, and this is our working node. This is a working node. So 2 working nodes. Now I'm going to show you 2 working nodes. So these are our 2 working nodes. You can see that 2 working nodes which are up and running, and this is a one more working node. So this is our cluster. It's clear. Now in working node you will have all this information that we will look into that later, but for now I want to show you this master node. In master node we have a lot of components, out of which API server is the one which we have discussed too much about it. So now I am going to show you that API server practically. Okay, and the API server, here it is. This is the API server that we have shown it to you in infographic, and this is that API server where it is, which is inside the master node. And how can we prove it? How can we prove that? This is how we prove it. See that API server has the public IP of master node. So That's how our API server looks like, and this is name of the cluster. Okay, now it's clear, the API server. Then we have discussed about the context, and then this is what type of object it is. It's a config type object. So we have begun with the config object. Then users. User name is this cubewipromlac.com, and then user certification, client certification data is that, and here is client key data. Basically, if you want to log into SSH, you need username as well as key. That's what we are doing now. When we say connector, let me show that also. Why to worry, we have when we have everything. So for example, let me click on here. So if you want to connect with this, so I'm usually copying this command, right? So this is consisting of user ID, Ubuntu, username, Ubuntu, and then here, see the key, ID, RSA, the key. Okay, so similarly, if you want to log into that cluster, you need a username that's mentioned on top and then client key. This is the key, we have to use it. Okay, so that's it about Cube. So how many things we have covered up? So documentation of Cube config API server has been demonstrated, and then we will explore config file. It's done. Now the final task in this config object is we will use the config file in our local machine to connect with our cluster from local machine. That's what we are going to do. So for that, I'm randomly opening our git bash anyway, or else I'll open it particularly in this directory. It's Linux. I'd go for Windows. I'll click on Windows. So Windows, there are plenty of options, but simply I'll go with Choco. Yeah, this is better for me. Copy this. It's the simplest and fastest. So do. Let me open Windows PowerShell. Run as administrator. Clear the screen. Paste it and execute it. So that's it. The kubectl has been installed, and then now let's get into the find out the kubectl version. Okay, it's 4.5.7. Let's create a directory cd and .cube. Done. So let's run that. Now let's get into our yeah, two files are there. Let me come here. Yeah, clear the screen. ls, the config file is there. Now let me say kubectl version help do cat / dot cube and config. Yes, there is a file client. Okay, this is a different file. It's a Docker desktop. It's kubecheren. So user name is something else. So Docker desktop. So I'm going to change this. So what will we do is we will do the cat of the same file, and because this file is connected from the Docker desktop, so that's the reason. Let me click to the Docker desktop. So by default it has taken Docker desktop file. Let me go to the settings, and here you should see Kubernetes. So from here the Kubernetes has been connected. You see that Kubernetes. So that's the reason. If you want to create a cluster from here, so that by default file is required. So that's the reason. So let me read that one more time. Yeah, cat, and you can see that file. Let us go through this file one more time. uh, cat cube and config. Yep, I think it's clear now. So the clusters, this is the cluster name, and the server is Kubernetes docker.internal, and the name is Docker Desktop. And here you should see the context. The cluster name is Docker Desktop and user name is kubecheren. I'll show you the username. And where is my Docker Desktop? I closed it. Yeah, this is my username. That's a Docker Desktop or kubecheren. And you see that the kubecheren, that's my username. Here, okay, fine. So that's what this the config file belongs to a Docker desktop. So what I will do is I will copy this and I'll place it in my, because after that I'm gonna use a Docker desktop, so I have to replace this. So that's the reason I'll copy this and paste it in my directory. So I'll take a text document. This is config Docker desktop. Yeah, let me save this and close it. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna replace this file. So vim, replace this with our config file, our default config file. So putting it in, so let me delete this, percentage d, enter. So I think all cleaned up, completely wiped up. So now let me get into my server and copy this from here till, yeah, till here. So copy and paste. That's it. Let you can see that user name cube, username is cubewipromlike.com, and cluster name, everything is fine. Yep, let's save it, and let me zoom it now. Let me do cube ctl version. That's okay. Now let me do kubectl get nodes. That's it. I'm in my local machine, and I am able to fetch the Kubernetes cluster from my local machine. You see that control plane node node 2. If you have a doubt, let's look into this. We'll copy this thing, or else we'll see, we'll compare both from here. Come to the EC2 instance, and EC2 instance, is running, and you should see both. Master node ends with 9E9, ends with 9E9. That's a control plane. Control plane ends with 9E9 46385B. Exactly correct. If you have a doubt, we can cross check here also. So kubectl get nodes. See that? Exactly. So that's the power of config object or config file. Basically, you can explore, you can connect with your Kubernetes cluster using kubectl from anywhere, from any machine, if you have a config file, if you have written a config file object. Okay, hence this also has been proven. So all this has been proven. Now I am gonna replace the our cube file with the existing Docker desktop, or else I can't use it again. So let me do the, sorry, percentage D to delete all. So all has been deleted. Now let me copy this. Where is my file? So it's here, it is the cube config docker. So control C and copy is done. Now let me paste it. I think it's properly pasted. So complete information, let me go up a bit. WQ, let me do that. Yeah, so Docker desktop user name is Docker desktop, client key, absolutely fine, it's all done. Hence proved that API server is part of master node, and we have practically demonstrated the same